Good morning and welcome. Thank you for joining Sylvia Weiss Women's Philanthropy's first Pritzker event of 2021. I'm Serena Clemens, and I'm honored to serve as a Pritzker co-chair alongside many remarkable women: Heidi Benditson, Jerry Cohen, Edie Desser, Jody Galen, Cheryl Green, Nomi Wallace, and Debbie Warfel. Our Pritzker series brings together the Jewish women of our community to learn, connect, and grow. We hear from thoughtful speakers who inspire us and challenge us to think bigger. A special thank you to Jeannie and Tony Pritzker for underwriting the series as a loving tribute to Tony's late mother, Susan S. Pritzker. The Jewish Federation of Greater Los Angeles identifies and addresses the greatest challenges and opportunities in our community, both locally and globally, especially in times of crisis. Our federation and our community rely on women like us to care for the most vulnerable and pave the way for generations to come. Thank you to our Sylvia Weiss Women's Philanthropy co-chairs, Karen Gettleman and Wendy Moss-Klein, who continue to lead us with grace and guide us to a brighter tomorrow. Today, we are grateful to be joined by Rabbi Steve Leder to discuss his new book, The Beauty of What Remains. It's wonderful. It's wonderful. But before we begin our featured program, I'd like to introduce our Federation's Senior Vice President of Community Engagement, Elisa Finston, to share about some of Federation's work. Please join me in welcoming Elisa.
Thank you so much, Serena. Thanks everyone for having me here today. I hope that everyone had a wonderful Passover and is enjoying the spring. As Serena mentioned, as you know, the Federation addresses the greatest challenges facing our community, and we create opportunities to meet those challenges. And this has never been more true than during COVID. Prior to this, we built an infrastructure of programs to take care of the most vulnerable, and we mobilized that network to respond to the need that the pandemic created. We launched new programs to provide food to local synagogue congregants and young adults who could not afford to buy groceries. We switched to meal deliveries, care packages, and increased in-home care for seniors. And we established new programs providing interest-free emergency education and business loans for families coping with dire financial circumstances and Jewish-owned businesses facing closures. These are among the many initiatives we launched to support our most vulnerable. And we did all of this while continuing to keep our community engaged and informed. I want to share a little bit about the work that the Community Engagement Initiative has been doing during COVID to keep people engaged and connected. In community engagement, we work hard all year long to build relationships with elected leaders, their staff, and other key public policymakers. Our goal is to connect the Jewish community to these leaders and to what is happening in Los Angeles, California, and our nation. We strive to give people the tools they need to stay civically engaged. We've been able to continue to do this during COVID over Zoom, and one could say it's actually been a little bit more successful and easier because of the flexibility that Zoom has offered for elected officials to participate in our programs. Since COVID began, we've hosted members of Congress, state officials, LA County supervisors, LA City Council members, and more. We've been able to do this because of the reputation that the Federation has at all levels of government. These relationships are so critical to our work, and we should all be very proud that the Federation continues to be recognized as a leader in the Los Angeles Jewish community. We did many of these Zoom programs in partnership with other organizations. Last year, we partnered with Jewish Family Service Los Angeles to offer a 3-part series called Connecting the Dots in the initial stages of COVID, so that we could bring information directly to our community about what was happening at all levels of government. We've also built a strong working relationship with the Los Angeles Urban League, because it is critical that we also connect with other communities in Los Angeles. And through these programs, we've hosted in conversation Representatives Karen Bass and Ted Lieu, then Secretary of State Alex Padilla, now Senator Padilla, Los Angeles County Supervisor Catherine Barger, and earlier this week, we hosted the 3 new Los Angeles City Council members, Nithya Raman, Kevin De Leon, and Mark Ridley Thomas in conversation. We've also continued our tradition of celebrating Jewish holidays with elected leaders so that they learn about Jewish traditions and can be stronger advocates for our community. Instead of being in city council chambers or the city hall rotunda, we were able to celebrate Rosh Hashanah and Hanukkah over Zoom. I think for Hanukkah, we had over 20 elected officials at all levels of government which is just remarkable and again speaks to the strong reputation of the Federation. And late last month, we hosted our annual Interfaith Community Leaders Passover Seder with the City of Los Angeles Civic and Human Rights and Equity Department with elected officials and other community leaders. And this program provided an intimate and connected communal space that gave voice to inspiring and hopeful stories from community leaders across our city. We've done all of these programs while continuing one of our signature programs, the Rautenberg New Leaders Project, which is our civic engagement leadership program where we cultivate and train the next generation of civic leaders. And we also continue to do advocacy work as a leading member of JPAC, the Jewish Public Affairs Committee of California, our statewide coalition of around 25 Jewish organizations. JPAC is currently being chaired by our own Allison Gingold and was previously chaired by Cece Filer. I want to end today by inviting you to join us next month for our virtual JPAC Advocacy Day, which will be held over 2 days during the week of May 10th. And while details are still being finalized, I'll make sure that Dylan has the information so she can get it out all to you. Thanks so much for having me today.
Hi, everyone. My name is Edie Desser. Thank you, Elisa. And it is truly my honor to introduce Rabbi Steve Leder. He is a very special rabbi. Steve Leder is the senior rabbi at Wilshire Boulevard Temple in Los Angeles, and he's been there for 30 years. He's an accomplished author and has taught homiletics, which is how to deliver better sermons, which I've had personal experience from help from him on that. I'll tell you a bit about that later. His first 3 books, The Extraordinary Nature of Ordinary Things, the second one, More Money Than God, Living a Rich Life Without Losing Your Soul, and third, More Beautiful Than Before, How Suffering Transforms Us, have all received critical acclaim. His new book, The Beauty of What Remains, How Our Greatest Fear Becomes Our Greatest Gift, published just this past January, has already been touted as elegant and compassionate by Publishers Weekly, and I can attest to it as well. He has so many accomplishments. He's a regular contributor and guest on the Today Show, writes for Time, Fox News, Maria Shriver's Sunday Paper, contributed a chapter to the NBA star Charles Barkley's book, Who's Afraid of a Large Black Man? He's published essays in Town and Country, LA Times, USA Today, and the Jewish Journal, where his Torah commentaries are read weekly by over 50,000 people. After graduating Northwestern and Oxford, Rabbi Leder received his master's degree in Hebrew letters in 1986 and rabbinical ordination in 1987 from Hebrew Union College, and that's when he joined Wilshire Boulevard Temple. Newsweek twice named him one of the top 10 most influential rabbis in America, but most important to Steve is being Betsy's husband and Aaron and Hannah's dad. On a personal note, many years ago when I first moved to Los Angeles and just joined Wilshire Boulevard Temple, I was called by the Jewish Federation in San Antonio and asked to be their keynote speaker for their Lions Outreach fundraising luncheon. So I wrote my entire presentation and I thought, something's missing. It's not powerful. It's not special. What should I do? And I thought, I'll call Rabbi Leder. So, he teaches homiletics. I figured he could help me. So I called him and enthusiastically and without pause, he said, of course, I'd love to help you. Send me what you got. So I sent him my presentation. He got on the phone with me and he says, you want to start with something powerful and end with that same powerful thing in a different way. And so he helped me rearrange that presentation and he really made it special, meaningful, and inspiring. And Rabbi, thank you so much for that. You helped me so much. You continue to help me. And I know he helps so many thousands of people. And I just have one question for you. Are you cloned? I don't know how he gets it all done, but it's pretty darn amazing. Today, Rabbi Leder will address the theme of loss, a theme too many of us have become familiar with over this past year. He is joined in conversation with Federation's Executive Vice President and Chief Program Officer, Becky Sobelman-Stern, who is married to Rabbi Ron Stern of Stephen Weiss Temple. Becky oversees our Federation's programmatic activities in Los Angeles, Israel, and internationally. Her leadership has continued to propel the Federation's active engagement with the community through program offerings, strategic partnerships, and relationships. She received her BS in Business Education from New York University and her Master's of Social Work and Community Organization from Hunter College. Together, Becky and Rabbi Leder will discuss grief and the specific role we as women play in guiding our families through loss.
Edie, thanks so much. And it's so wonderful to be with all of you this morning. And Rabbi Leder, thank you for being with us today.
You're welcome. Happy to be here.
I am going to call him Steve. And why can I do that? He is a partner of the Federations, a dear communal leader. And I guess if I can call the guy I live with at home by his first name, I do not call him Rabbi. I call him Ron. I figure I can call you Steve. So listen, I have been married to a rabbi who serves a congregation for, at this point, 36 years. And I too have watched him honestly and compassionately serve his congregation through the process of death. He too, as you will hear Steve talk about, have found those moments to be some of the most meaningful that he has had with members of his congregation. The Beauty of What Remains, Steve's latest book, is a reflection on death and mourning and the grieving process and the gift that that gives us. Steve, your book is far more than an obituary. As you say, it reflects many truths, making it a sincere eulogy. May your dad, Lenny Leder's memory be for a blessing. So you are with a group of women, Steve.
Yes.
So I'm first going to have to, probe around that. Your book was so much about you, your dad, and the relationship between you. But would love for you to reflect for this wonderful group that we have with us today about the difference between the way women grieve, mourn, and care for their families versus maybe something that you've seen from the other gender. And you are the father of a son. I am the mother of a son. Is that going to change in the next generation? So let's start there.
Oh, okay. All right. First of all, thank you for doing this, Becky, and thank you, Edie, for that really kind introduction. And thank you, everyone who's watching today. This is hopefully, I think it will be, given that it's in Becky's capable hands, this is going to be a meaningful conversation for all of us. Look, I think the assumption in the question is that women and men are different in grief and loss and death and mourning, which is true. But the larger truth is men and women are different in virtually all things. And the differences in life are no different than the differences when in death. I mean, this is one of the fundamental points of the book, is that there's this mythology around death in our culture that it changes everything. It changes a family's dynamic. It changes the personality of the dying. It changes the personality of the living. And the truth of the matter is that death is life's mirror. Death reflects how we lived. It doesn't change us. There's Heinrich Heine, the German poet, had a joke about Jews. He said, the Jews are like everyone else, just more so. And that's true of death. It makes us who we are, just more so. So it accentuates these differences. And obviously we're generalizing here. There are men who are highly evolved and empathic and emotionally aware in the way many women are. And there are women who are withholding and cut off from their own feelings. So we're generalizing here, but generally speaking, women in life as compared to men have more whole, constant, juicy, authentic friendships than men. If you ask most men who their best friend is, they will give you the name of some guy who lives in another city who they see maybe once or twice a year. And they really mean it. They really mean that that is their best friend. And men have task-specific friendships. They have their tennis buddy. They have their, partner at work. They, have their, attorney or their physician friend. And these friendships are very task specific. So the guy that Ron skis with is probably not the same guy, that Ron goes to have a beer with and talk about his troubles, right? So we have these task specific friendships and they're limited. And women have these big, whole, juicy, friendships. They know everything. They call each other and talk about what they're going to do. Then they do it. Then they call each other and talk about what they did. It's a different dynamic. And it is a much better holding environment, a much better comfort when you experience loss to have those kinds of relationships in your life than these task-specific relationships, which don't really hold you or sustain you all that well when you're suffering. And so I think that women tend to fare better in grief and mourning than men. But it has to do with the fact that I think women fare better relationally in life than men. Most men's best friend, if they're married, is their spouse. And as I said before, and a second place would go to someone who lives in New York or Chicago or who knows where. So I think that's the biggest difference, is that women have more comfort and emotional collateral to rely on when they face a loss. Now, they also have more to give when they are tending and caring for others. We haven't had Shivas in more than a year, which has been very painful. But next time, and there will be a next time you're at a Shiva, sit in the corner and be an observer for a moment and watch the interactions of the women and watch the interactions of the men. And generally speaking, you will see women looking out to take care of others, and you'll see men sitting in the same place for a long period of time, talking to the same one person. And I think that tells you a lot. So I have to give women, generally speaking, again, a much higher grade. They're better at it. And I find this to be problematic in many ways when I'm at an Orthodox Shiva, because as you know, the women are in the hallway or the back, or not there at all. And I have a friend whose father died just before COVID, and I went to Shiva. I wasn't there every night. I was there most nights, and he's Orthodox. And the men davened and left, and the women weren't really allowed, frankly, to be a part of the whole process. So I have to say, I feel in a way sorry for men who grieve in that community when that is the case. It's different, and I think must be more difficult, although I haven't experienced myself. So that, I hope that's a full enough answer for you. But women are in death as they are in life, which is much better at it than men.
So I'm not sure how those on the line will feel about that response, but I think you certainly reflected the power of women and the power of how they come together, the power of how they organize, and the power of how they get stuff done.
Yeah.
Yeah. So listen, one type of grief we've seen so many people amongst our community was the issue of mental health and how isolated and alone they felt. Elisa Finston so beautifully talked about some of our programs, and we work so hard at the Federation to create ways of connecting our core line, in particular, women's groups, professional networks. In addition to isolation, what different types of loss and grief, how does the structure of loss and grief, how did that play itself out this year? Yeah. The fact that we couldn't humanly touch each other, humanly hug each other. So yeah. I'm sure you've been thinking about that as you're thinking about your next book even, right?
I have. We've all, look, first of all, many of us have literally lost loved ones who were dear to us. There was a period during COVID when I was at the cemetery 3, 4, 5 times a week for weeks on end. So there's that, right? Which we can talk about is what was it like to grieve and mourn literally in the era of COVID. But there were so many other losses. I think the biggest, and I think the one with the longest tail when this thing is over, and I think the one that is subtly present without us being fully aware of it, is the loss of our sense of invulnerability. I think we all realize now how vulnerable we are, not just as individuals, but as a species. You know, it's easy to forget. I often tell people who are facing a terrible situation that they'll be surprised at what they can get used to. And I think that's been true of all of us during COVID. We've gotten used to it, but let's go back to last March and remember what it was like, how frightened we were, how anxious we were, how we didn't want to touch anything, how we would come back if we had to go out and disrobe on the front porch and throw it in the laundry and take a shower and wipe down every package. And every person we encountered outside of our home was encountered with great anxiety and suspicion and fear. And there were shortages, and it took the lid off of our sense of invulnerability. And that is a humbling, important lesson. To have us all learning it at the same time, I think was incredibly frightening and a real loss to us. The second thing I would say is, look, a lot of us lost businesses, lost money. Most Jewish organizations suffered terribly. And, you know, we had, again, this loss of security. And we lost the right for our children to be in school, which is where they belong. And as you so rightly pointed out, Becky, you know, we all lost, I think, the most fundamentally beautiful thing about being human, which is to hold and be held by people we love. You know, I have an 87-year-old mother in Minneapolis in assisted living. I haven't hugged my mother in 14 months. So we all lost that. And I think that's the real downside. And I think these things really are going to have a long tail, and we're going to feel them for a long time. The way our parents and grandparents who lived through the Depression lived with it the rest of their lives. You know, they were in remission, but it was there. And I think we're going
Trauma, for sure. Trauma.
Yeah, there's going to be PTSD. Now, not everything about the pandemic has been negative. There have been some really, look, this is why I called the book The Beauty of What Remains. There are beautiful things that I hope remain from the losses that we've endured, just as there are beautiful things that remain from the loss of the life of a loved one. You know, I hope that we've all learned that it's who we have, not what we have, that matters. I hope we've all learned that a little is a lot and good is great. You know, I hope we've all learned, well, let me just speak personally. My life before the pandemic was frenetic, absolutely frenetic. And I am not going to go back to spending 45, 50 minutes, an hour on the 405 or the 10 at war with other drivers to get to a meeting with 3 other people at one of our campuses that I could have just as easily met with on Zoom. You know, I have a closet upstairs full of suits and expensive suits and ties and shoes and belts from, you know, Paris and Milan and wherever. Because, and I don't know if Ron experienced this or not. His insecurities are probably different than mine, but I always felt that I had to look the part of the senior rabbi of Wilshire Boulevard Temple, dress the part. And you know what COVID taught me? Nobody cares. Nobody cares. That was my problem, not anyone else's. And I'm not going back to being uncomfortable. I hope, you know, I hope. I'm trying to remember who said it. I think it was Ruskin. someone said, before we congratulate people on their freedom, we should wait and see what they're going to do with it. Now he was referring to the French Revolution. I'm referring to COVID, which is going to end. And when it does, before we congratulate ourselves on all these changes it made, how we're going to spend more time with our children, cooking and baking, we're going to spend more time at home, we're going to buy less and do more and hug the people we love and never take them for granted again. Let's see what we do with our freedom. Are we going to revert back to our default setting before COVID? Or have we really learned something? And is this going to be a permanent and positive change? Is there going to be something beautiful left behind? Because as I often say, and I'm sure people who are watching have heard me say it, if you have to go through hell, don't come out empty-handed.
Yeah, so Steve, you talk a little bit in the book about the process of mourning and coming out of Shiva.
Yeah.
And I often wonder if we as a Jewish community need a Jewish ritual as we come out of COVID, because it is a getting up, it is a moving forward.
Well, I think
I wonder about that a lot. What is the ritual that, we are constantly reinventing Judaism? That is the beauty, especially of Reform Judaism.
Yeah.
And what is the ritual that we need for that?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. The first thing that comes to mind to me is mikvah, is a kind of renewal. But I also think there's another side to that coin, Becky, is how are we going to memorialize? I mean, today is Yom HaShoah. How are we going to memorialize this so that we don't dismiss it as something that has nothing to teach us? Look, we have a memorial for the Vietnam War veterans, war soldiers who died. There were about, I think, 50,000 of them. We have a stunning memorial in New York to the 3,000 plus people who were killed in the Twin Towers, murdered, right? 555,000 Americans have died of COVID. We have to have a memorial. This has to become a part of the consciousness of our nation so that we hold on to everything it has taught us about taking care of each other, so that we hold on to the imperative to do something about the social, racial, and economic divide in our country, right? So it's both. How do we say, Kadima, let's move forward to the future? How do we get up from the Shiva? But also, where is the yahrzeit? Where is the memorial? They're both important.
I agree. And something that we should think about and talk about.
Yep.
So you were transparent enough, open enough to talk so much about, your relationship with your dad, with your family. And I wonder how your own family felt about your immediate family as well as your sisters, right?
Yeah.
How they felt about you exposing so much of your personal self and life. Probably from some of you on this Zoom, you have asked your rabbi, what is it like? What is your personal life like? How do you balance it? I get the questions a lot. What's it like to be married to a rabbi? So I ask you, how did they feel about you exposing so much?
Well, first of all, they're used to it, which is the good news, because I've done it in sermons, and my book previous to this book, the book that's called More Beautiful Than Before, How Suffering Transforms Us, I was fairly transparent. Look, the truth is, I pulled punches in both books. There's a lot I didn't talk about because it's too personal. It would be embarrassing either to me or to others. There's a very high price that all leaders and healers and caregivers pay for doing the work they do. So to be really transparent, I wasn't totally transparent. However, the things I wrote about with absolute truth and transparency. And my siblings, my brother sent me an email. He said, is there anything about me in the new book? And I wrote back, no, and I'm sure he was relieved. And there was just a tiny part that was benign. The night before the book launched on January 5th. The night before the book launched, for the members of Wilshire Boulevard Temple, I invited my 4 siblings to Zoom with me to talk about their reactions to the book. And you know this as a social worker, I'm one of 5. All children, no 2 children are raised under the same roof, right? No 2 children are raised by the same parents, even though biologically they are of the same parents. So the 5 of us each had different relationships with our father and appreciated him in different ways and struggled and suffered in different ways because of who he was. So it was a really interesting and honest conversation. I would say that my family, they're very modest. They've stayed within 5 miles of the home we grew up in. They're Midwesterners. I would say, to be honest, that the book made them uncomfortable. It made them obviously sad because they had to relive some of what has healed. I'm sure it pulled the scab off in some ways. But I think they also know, look, this is Steve. This is who he is. This is what he does. At the end of the day, he's a storyteller, and this is his story. And he had no choice but to tell it. I know they understand me that well, but did it make them uncomfortable? Yes. Would they? It was very hard for them to be on that Zoom. They did it out of love for me, not because they wanted to. And I mostly left my wife and kids out of this one. And that's because it also makes them uncomfortable.
So maybe you're getting to the issue of grief comes in waves.
Yes. Yeah. Let's
talk about that. And
Yeah.
you're talking really right now about the waves that you've almost forced on your siblings a little bit by having to relive.
Yes. Yes.
It's really a beautiful, beautiful analogy. I know for me who lost my dad, that was a powerful thing to think about. So it'd be great if you could reflect a little bit more on that.
So I'm 60 years old, and I don't know how old you are, but we're the same generation. I'm pretty sure of that.
Yeah.
And our generation was the first, and every generation hence, to be raised primarily with the thinking of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross when it comes to death and grief, right? She wrote the book, The 5 Stages of Dying, and she wrote the book, The 5 Stages of Grief. And I was raised with it. We all were. And the problem with the title, more so than the book, because in the book, she kind of accepts that it's more fluid, but the title alone creates this notion that grief is a linear process, that first you feel A, then B, then C, then D, then E, and then you're done. And any of us who grieve, we know that grief is an entirely non-linear experience. The way I put it in the book is paraphrasing Tom Friedman talking about the Middle East. So Tom Friedman said, anyone who thinks the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line doesn't understand the Middle East. I just changed it and said, anyone who thinks the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line doesn't understand grief. So I find the wave metaphor, as you mentioned, much, much closer to the truth. Grief comes in waves that are very close together and very large and very punishing at first. They do spread out and get further apart over time. And yet, it is also true. You can have calm, beautiful seas and sunny skies for a week, for a month, for a year, for a decade even. And then out of nowhere, a massive rogue wave of grief can rise to your child's wedding. When I'm under the chuppah at my son's wedding, I'm pretty sure a rogue wave of grief is going to destroy me, missing my father. So now let's extend this metaphor further, because this is also, I think, a helpful way to understand how to approach grief when it approaches you, how to welcome it as opposed to resisting it. And this is, the book in many ways is about what Steve Leder, the son, learned that Steve Leder, the rabbi, never really understood despite his experience, vicarious experience with death. So the old Steve Leder, before my dad died, when I was faced with a wave, any wave, a wave of a lot of work, a wave of anxiety, a wave of pressure, my default setting was to plant my feet in the sand, stick my chest out forward, and say to myself, I am going to stand my ground because I am more powerful than that wave. And then my dad died. And maybe this has been true for COVID for all of us. And then I learned that the better way to go when a wave is coming at me, especially a wave of grief, is to just lie down, let it wash over me, and just float. Just float with it until I can stand up again. And very importantly, while I'm floating, to reach out my hand and just see if there's someone there who can hold my hand while I float and help me stand when I'm ready. The Talmud says the prisoner cannot free himself. That's such a powerful idea. Death teaches us the humility. I can only speak for myself. We are only experts in our own grief. Death has taught me, it humbled me, it taught me to reach out when I'm suffering, to trust those relationships that so many women have and the handful that I am lucky enough to have. So I find this wave metaphor much closer to the truth than the linear notion of grief. And I hope it's helpful to people.
Yeah. I am guessing that many on this Zoom would agree with you. We're going to take questions in a moment. I'm going to pose one more question to Steve. So if you want to put them in the chat, I'll try to curate appropriately and pose a few more questions. Steve, I was blessed with a father that understood preparation. And so my father actually did write an ethical will for our family. In particular, I keep it in my talit bag. And for sure, on days of mourning, I take that out.
That's beautiful.
And it is something that certainly, when we light the Yortzeit candle before Yom Kippur, I do try to read it when we're all gathered. That doesn't always happen, don't always have Ron there. And certainly, unbeknownst to my children, I Xeroxed the letter, which is in my father's physical handwriting, which is really quite amazing, and stuck it in each of their talit bags. Very subtle, Mom, but nonetheless, it may not, as you have said, been a physical legacy that he gave them. He was a teacher. He was a guidance counselor. It wasn't the monetary. It was the emotional legacy. So you hinted to us that you're writing another book.
Yes.
And it is about ethical will. So maybe you want to talk about that. And I guess I share with this group of women how powerful that handwritten letter has been. It is something that grounds me every day. And even though we talk about death a lot in our family, that was an actual example of me, had a role model for my own children.
Yeah. So there's a chapter in the book titled "Nobody Wants Your Crap."
Right.
Which, by the way, is what I wanted to call the book, but the publisher felt it was it lacked elegance. The title of that chapter came from a friend of mine who, after her mother died in Florida and she came back, she's a temple member named Deborah. I said, well, what did you learn through the experience of your mother's death? And she said, you know what I learned? Nobody wants your crap. And she meant the double entendre, okay? Nobody wants your emotional crap, and nobody wants all the stuff. We spend our lives working to make money, to buy stuff that at the end of our lives means literally nothing, even to our children and grandchildren. They don't want most of it. The goodwill won't even take half of it. So it's really important that we understand the power of words, that words for Jews are of material value, concrete, real value. Look, the Hebrew word for word, davar, is the same as the Hebrew word for thing, davar. I think psycholinguistically that tells us something, that words really matter from a Jewish perspective. I think they matter from a human perspective. So I really encourage in the book people to leave words to their children, not just stuff to their children. And Jews have been doing this since the medieval period, since the 11th century in Germany, Italy, and France, literally taking the time to sit down and write a letter to your children and maybe your grandchildren, if you don't have children, to the people you love who will mourn you when you're gone, and lay it out for them. These are the things that I have discovered in life that really matter. These are my hopes and dreams for you. These are my blessings for you. This is what I ask forgiveness for. This is what I grant forgiveness. This is who I grant forgiveness to, you know, an opportunity to really hold your loved ones after you're gone with words. So the next book is going to be, it's a series of questions and essays about those questions and many people's answers to those questions to help us all sit down and write a will. And I'll tell you something, the reason most people don't write it, there are a couple of reasons most people don't do it. First, unlike your father, they're in denial of death. They don't want to face their mortality. They don't want to write that letter to their children because it means they're reckoning with the fact that they really are going to die. Second, people often say to themselves, I'm not a writer. I won't be able to do it. And the truth is, if you have the right questions and you answer authentically and sincerely, that letter to your children will just pour out of you. I've seen people write their ethical wills in 15 minutes because you know what's in there if you just can unlock it. So it's a very important thing. Mine is bound with our estate plan. So the kids can't get to the money until they read the ethical will. One question for you, Becky. Did your father read it to you before he died, or did you only read it after he died?
Oh, that's interesting. He wrote it before he had open heart surgery, and thank God he made it through that. So he knew we had all read it, and then he lived many, I don't know, 15 years post that. But he was a guy who always talked about finances, where his money was, that we should be prepared. So
that was his nature. Yeah.
But I love that idea of bounding it and putting it with, your will.
Yeah, and I encourage people to read it, not to wait till they're dead for their children to read their ethical wills. I think it's as instructive when you're alive as it is, when you're gone.
We have thanks. And here's a question. If your loved one is buried in another state, what ritual can you do close to home?
That's me. That's my situation. My father's buried in Minneapolis, where I was raised. I do, first of all, I think of him, when I say Kaddish every day. I'm not saying the mourner's Kaddish, but I think of him every day. There's a picture of my dad with me in my closet on the dresser. I look at it every morning when I get dressed. And that's a moment for me. And then, of course, Judaism has obviously built into it these 5, 4 Yizkor and 1 Yortzeit moment every year, 5 times a year. We light a candle and we remember. And so I think people should create meaningful ways. A picture is really moving for me. I don't know if some people think it's a little spooky. I don't, because I love seeing a picture of my dad and remembering him before the Alzheimer's. That's the guy, who I want to remember. And then, of course, I think it's a little bit like the wave metaphor. Allow these memories, when they come, to sit with you. Don't push them aside. My dad comes to me so often I'm experiencing something and I think I know exactly what he would say. I know exactly what completely inappropriate Yiddish expression he would use. I know what he would do. And I don't suppress those moments. I enjoy them. And I talk to my kids about my dad, and I talk to my wife about my dad, and I tell her I really miss my dad right now. And I tell my son often, I say, oh, you know what Papa would have said right now. I think it's a way of honoring our own loss and the beauty. This is the beauty that remains. They're still with us. You know,
They are
love,
still with us.
you know, it's so cliche to say it, but people die. Love doesn't die.
So I'm going to use a little bit of another cliche to address or ask one of the questions in the chat. Life is short. So in your mind, what's the right time? What's the right stage? Somebody posed, what's the right age to sit and put your thoughts and your ethical will down on paper? And, you know, I suppose in my mind, you write it once, it can be edited 10 years later, but
Well, yeah, my answer is now. The answer is now for two reasons, one of which you've already mentioned. I wrote my first ethical will when I was 40. I wrote my second when I was 60. I think that's fine. In some ways, they're similar. In many ways, they're very different, because in some ways I am similar and in some ways I am very different. So I would say the time to write your ethical will is now, because yes, you can always write it again later, but as importantly, the truth is you never know. You never know. Your father thought, quite legitimately, Becky, he might die as a result of that surgery. And he might have. So I think that now is the answer. It's never too soon. And there's nothing morbid about that. So that's my answer. The appropriate age and time is now.
maybe you want to reflect just on, and the person who put this in the chat felt quite liberated by the fact that you articulated that in death or going through the grieving process, you're not trying to change a relationship.
That's right.
And I too felt that very liberating.
Yeah.
Reflect on that a little bit, and then I got one quote. Maybe you know, you'll end us on a thinking about the future, Steve.
Okay.
Thinking about the future of our Jewish community. Thinking about what good is really great means for us as we go forward.
Okay. Well, look, the question is really under that idea that we have this fantasy about death, that it changes people's personalities, changes a family's dynamic. And the truth is, it just doesn't. And sometimes that's beautiful. You know, if you have this great, loving, laughing, generous family in life, they're going to be that way in death. If you have that kind of relationship with someone who's dying in life, you're going to have that relationship with death. But it is equally true. Let me give you a concrete example. I get a call that goes something like this: Steve, I haven't really spoken to my mother in 10 years. I text her every year on her birthday, but you know, before those 10 years, every time I engaged with her, I ended up feeling hurt and less than. She's narcissistic, she's withholding, she's cold. And she's toxic to my family and my marriage and to me. And I'm just better off not engaging. But now she's dying. And I'm really worried that I'm just going to feel so guilty about all of that when she's dead. To which I say, I'm about to share what you might think is a dark truth, but I hope it will be liberating for you, which is, more often than not, people in your situation don't feel guilty when that person dies. They're relieved. And that's the truth of it. And no one wants to tell you that or say it because it sounds so cold and cruel, but actually, you have every right to protect yourself from her in death, just as you did in life. You had to. And you're going to be relieved. You're going to be fine. And that's the truth. Now, and by the way, this is a lot more common than people think. It's not predominant, but it is a lot more common than people think. Almost everyone I know, myself included, has someone with whom they used to be close that they no longer talk to. They had to cut them out of their life. I do, you do, almost everyone I know does. So that's life, and therefore that's death. And no shame required. Future. I'm actually optimistic about the future, because I think from a Jewish perspective, because I think that COVID gave us a kick in the pants that we needed. You know, I was listening to NPR last week, some guy from the grocery industry who said that online grocery orders are at a level today where the industry predicted they would be 5 years from now, right? Everybody got with the online program quickly. The Jewish community, I think, for the most part, has dabbled with technology, dabbled with live stream, dabbled with social media, but hasn't really taken it seriously the way we should. And COVID has forced us to do it. It's been a very expensive and difficult education, but I think we all realize now that we need to up our game, and we have, and I think we'll continue to do so. Now, I'm also a big believer in brick and mortar Judaism. Because COVID and technology also revealed the very real limitations of online learning for children. It just doesn't work very well. And Judaism is such a pediatrically driven enterprise. So, we've doubled down on brick and mortar. We're merging. We just merged with another synagogue. We're taking on more physical space, not less, because I think there's also going to be a real pent up demand for people to be together, sing together, pray together, celebrate together, eat together, mourn together. And I think parents and children are going to appreciate school in a way they didn't before. Literally being at school is going to be a blessing and a gift. So I'm optimistic about that. I also, and look, I can't speak to other institutions, but I also saw our community really step up financially to help the temple. They, I think for the first time, realized, like, oh my goodness, this whole thing could disappear. There are temples disappearing. There are Jewish organizations that are just gone. And because they've seen that with the nail salon and the restaurant and everything else around them, these places that we used to go to are literally gone, not closed, gone. So at least I can only speak for my own community. When I reached out, people understood it in a way they really didn't understand it before. And I think this has to go back to that original point about COVID having pierced our sense of invulnerability. Some of that piercing is positive, because we now understand better how important it is that we do our best and we take care of each other and we take care of our institutions. So look, I'm generally optimistic in life. So maybe I'm the wrong guy to ask about this, but I think we've learned a lot that will help us going forward. And I'm optimistic about that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And we certainly at the Federation have looked at models in all sorts of different ways, certainly try to support programs, institutions, certainly children, certainly camps.
Yes.
And it really is a pleasure to be in partnership with you, Steve, and with Wilshire Boulevard Temple, with Wilshire Boulevard Temple Camps, with Browerman. That's all about community, being in community, building community, even though we have to look at building community a little bit differently than we have before.
As we should, right? As we should, right?
So this has been, for me, such a pleasure, so fun. And I thank Wendy, Karen, and Dylan for giving me this opportunity to be in conversation with you, Rabbi Steve Leder. And I'm now going to turn the program back, I believe, to Wendy and Karen, or Karen and Wendy, whichever order. So Steve, again, thank you so much.
And, thank you. I appreciate it.
Don't get frenetic.
I'm going to try not to.
Stay the course.
Becky, thank you so much for moderating. You did a fabulous job. And to Steve, as we expected, your insights are always so thoughtful, inspirational, and meaningful. Recently, we were on a Zoom call talking about this event, and I shared with the group a story about you and how you touched my family. 2 years ago, you may remember, my father-in-law passed away. I felt like within hours, you called me and said, "Is there anything I can do for you or your family?" And I think I was in shock. I couldn't believe how quickly you called me, even though you were crazy busy. But more importantly, I just couldn't believe your kindness, compassion, and accessibility. You were there for my family in every way. And we will always be grateful to you for this. The funny part of this story is that everyone that I've spoken to that has lost a loved one and is a member of Wilshire Boulevard Temple has had a similar experience that I had. You are present, willing to help, and guide within moments to every congregant. We all wonder, how does Steve do that? I just want you to know that it never goes unnoticed, and we all love and appreciate you so much. We are all so grateful today that you wrote your beautiful book, The Beauty of What Remains, so that the world can be touched by your heartfelt, honest learnings and guidance. We thank you really from the bottom of our hearts for being here today. And thank you so much, Steve. This is the first time I read this without crying. I just want you to know. So thank you.
Thank
with
you.
lots
Wendy.
of love. We
Thank
really
you.
appreciate you being here.
Thank you. I love you back.
Love you.
You do.
And now I'm very honored to introduce my amazing, cherished, and lovely co-chair, Karen Gettleman, to share final remarks. Thanks, Karen.
Thank you, Wendy. And thank you again to Rabbi Leder for leading us in this meaningful dialogue and how much we can learn and grow when dealing with loss and change. We are so fortunate to share our morning and our first Pritzker event of the year with you. Thank you also to our incredible Becky Sobelman-Stern for personally and compassionately guiding this heartening conversation, and also for the amazing work you do and continue to do as Chief Program Officer for our Federation. Today was really so special and inspirational. Thank you to our Pritzker co-chairs, Edie, Serena, Nomi, Heidi, Jerry, Cheryl, Debbie, and Jody for all your efforts in making this program so memorable. And thank you to our vice chairs, Laura and Linda, for your dedication and continued support for all we do. And of course, a very big Toda Rabah to our fabulous SWWP professionals, our awesome Dylan and Lauren, for all the hard work you put into all of our programs. And thank you to our Executive VP, Lori Tessel, for your ongoing guidance and input in our work. Sylvia Weiss Women's Philanthropy continues to provide a space for us to connect to each other while deepening our connection to Jewish LA. Tonight begins Yom HaShoah, the day of remembrance for the 6 million Jews that perished in the Holocaust by the hands of Nazis and their collaborators. We spoke this morning about heartache and loss, and it is painful to remember and reflect on the history of the Holocaust. But we join our survivors and their families and commit to never again, to ensure that the horrors are never erased from memory and that the dangers of hate are not forgotten. Throughout these days of remembrance, all of humanity should pause and remember those who suffered, as well as those who fought and continue to tell the story. Oseh Shalom B'Romav. May the one who makes peace in the high places make peace on us and on all Israel. And let us say Amen. Thank you for joining us today. And thank you again for your generous support of our Federation. We look forward to seeing you at more of our upcoming events. Keep an eye out for our next Pritzker program in the next couple of months. Wishing you all a lovely afternoon.